All right, so in this video, we're gonna do a web app to clock in and clock out. And I'm going to basically take my other clock in and clock out video that I did with Google Forms and basically just change the form to be a web app. So basically, if I just go to the form, currently we have this form where we can enter clock in, clock out as an action, and then employee ID and verification code. And whatever we submit, it's going to this worksheet. And basically, it's going to enter clock in, clock out, depending on what's selected in the form. And then it's gonna do employee ID and verification code. And the timestamp automatically just goes in here when we submit the form. So the problem with the current setup is that if we clock in, then we can go back and clock in again, or we can clock out multiple times. And there's nothing in Google Forms to prevent this from happening, right? So we can just keep adding more records, and there's no difference if it's a clock in or clock out or whatever. And the second problem we have is that when the verification code doesn't match, it's still gonna let this thing through. Now, we did some sort of conditional formatting to highlight it if that happens, but it would be nicer to just not let that person to clock in or clock out if they don't have the correct verification code. So as far as the whole setup, I'm gonna leave it the same. So if you don't know how this whole thing works, I'm gonna link to the video that shows all the formulas and everything else I did here to make this thing work. But for us, we basically are going to replace this form with a web app. So I'll go to Tools and Script Editor in this Google Sheet, and we'll rename this project. So let's start building the HTML for this form. So I'm gonna go ahead and add a new file, HTML. Let's just call it form. And basically here, I'm gonna use Metro UI to build the form mostly. So I'll go to metroui.org.ua, go to Get Started. So let's just find our starter template here. There it is. So I'm just gonna copy all of this, go to my editor and just replace all of this with that starter template. So now in the body of this, we're gonna build the form. So I'm gonna go back to this. Let's go to components. And I'm gonna try to find the form. See form components. So let's start with, I guess, input. Similar to this inputs right in here. So we need two of those, one for employee ID and the other one for verification code. So as you can see, it's just an input box. And this is an input box with a little like label username. So I think that's what I'm gonna use. I'm gonna just copy this, go back to our script. I'm gonna start by removing this H1. And let's start by first creating a form. And in this form, we'll start adding those inputs. This is one, and I need another one, so I'll just copy paste this. And the first one is going to be employee ID. And the second one is our verification code. Just like that. So I'm gonna go back to my documentation here. We're gonna need some sort of button to submit this. So I'm gonna go to here under base, under forms. Let's see if we have it in here. See, we have a form. This also has a nice structure if you wanted to do this way, which we probably will do. So we probably want to wrap this inputs inside of this divs as they show here, just to have some sort of spacing and structure here. So I'm just gonna copy this and go back and put our first input inside of this div and then close the div right after the input element. And then we'll repeat the same for our second input. Just like that. I'm going to go back to this. We don't need the checkbox here. We do need the button. See this submit data. So I'm just going to copy this last div form group and paste it below these. Tab it in just to align all of these to be nice. And I'm going to use the button, the first one. So I'm going to actually do two buttons. One of them will be clock in. And I'm going to copy paste that button. And for this one, it's going to be clock out. So let me just zoom out a little bit. So mainly, pretty much, this is what I did. This is that form that I just built. And inside of that form, we have two of our inputs, two of our buttons. I'm going to go ahead and add IDs to some of these elements. So I'm going to start with the form. So I'm going to add an ID to my form to make sure we can find this form. So this will be main form. Then I'm going to add an ID to our inputs. This will be our employee ID and our verification code. I'll just call it V code. And then I'm going to also add a type to these buttons. And finally, add some sort of data attribute to be able to know which button it is. So the first one, I'm going to do data dash action. So for this, it will be clock in. And we'll do the same for our clock out. That's that. And finally, below this form, we'll have some sort of div to do some sort of output message. Let's just give this an ID. Message. All right, we'll probably restyle all of this a little bit later on, but for now, that should be most of what we need out of our form. Now let's try to see what this looks like. So we need to load this form HTML as a web app. So to do that, we're going to go to our code.js and we're going to make a function. We're going to call this one doGet. And what we're going to do, this is a special name, doGet function, which is our web app endpoint. So we're going to just return HTML. So what we need to return is basically this HTML file. So I'm going to take HTML service, create HTML output from file. And the file we're going to use is that form file. This is this file name right here. And I think that should be good enough for us. So I'm going to just save this. Let's try to see what this looks like. So I'm going to deploy this as a web app. So I'm going to go under deploy, new deployment. We're going to select the type right here, web app, some name. So in this, we should choose anyone really, because in the end of the day, we want this to be publicly accessible for anybody to go in and enter whatever they have to do. So in my case, for training purposes, I'm just going to leave it only myself. That's good enough. And it should execute as you. I'm going to deploy this. This is going to create the actual link to the app itself, but we're not going to use this during development. For development, I'm going to click done, go to same deploy and go to test deployments. And right here, we have our dev link. So if I click on that, it should basically show us what we've done so far. So we have this employee ID where we can enter our employee ID. We have verification code here, and then we have clock in and clock out. Now, the first problem with our form is going to be, right now, if I enter some sort of employee ID and some sort of verification code, when I hit clock in or clock out, it's going to submit the form to this action page, which doesn't exist. So basically to nowhere, and we get here. So we want to make sure that doesn't happen when we click on sign in and sign out. Let's just refresh this so it gets back to our previous page. So now I'm going to go back to our app, and we're going to continue right here. Go back to our form HTML and do our work in here. So I'm going to go below this Metro script and add my own script tag. And this is where I'm going to be writing my code. At least the front end side of the code will all go in here. So in here, I'm going to start by first creating a global variable. And that will be an object to hold all of those things in it. Now, what I want to do when the page loads, I want to start by getting access to all the things I'm going to need from here. So I'm going to get access to the form itself. I'm going to basically store references to this input, this button, and this button. So all 5 things that I have IDs for, I want to make sure I get to those. As a matter of fact, I didn't actually store a reference for these buttons as an ID, so let's do that. So I'll just use the same clock in and clock out for those. So I'm going to go in here and we'll basically create a function within this object to run when the page loads. I'm going to call it onLoad, and that's going to be a function. And this function needs to run when the whole thing loads. So for that, we're going to do document, add event listener. Everything here is case sensitive, so you want to be careful. So the event we're going to listen is when the page loads. So that's the DOM content loaded. And when that happens, after this comma, we're going to run this function. So as soon as the page loads, because of this event listener, it's going to run this function. And this is where we're going to do what we need to do. So we're going to start getting references to all of those things we have on top. And we're going to store all of them inside of this object. So I'll just do some names for this. So I need the form, the employee ID, input box, verification code, then we have 2 buttons. And then finally, we have the message box. So we're going to find all of those things by their IDs. So I'm going to do document get element by ID. And the ID for the form is right in here, main form. And we're going to do the same thing for all of the rest of these elements. So the input element for employee ID, this, the ID is this. And you can probably see where this is going. Let's actually call this clock in. So now we have references to all of these things that we care about out of that HTML, so we can work with those. So let's start first by stopping the form from sending all of that to another page, which is this form right in here. So for that, we'll basically add an event listener to the form. And the event will be submit. And when that event happens, we want to run some sort of function. That function doesn't exist anymore, but we're going to create that function inside of this object again. I'm just going to take that and do a function on submit. And what I want to do here, I just want to stop it from going to that non-existing action. So we'll just create this function here after this bracket that's closing this right here. Let's actually just comment this so we know what this is for. So now I'm going to create this function right here. And the way this function is going to work, it will accept this E argument from the form submission itself, from this event. And on that E, there is this method prevent default. So what this is going to do right now, if I just go back and refresh this dev page, if I go here and enter something and click on clock in, see, it doesn't send me to that blank page. So that's what that prevent default does. It stops that from going to that action page. Now we can handle our actions however we like them. Now the next thing I want to do, I want to add an event to my clock in. So I'm going to take the button and add an event listener for that. And when somebody clicks on that button, I want to trigger a function again. Again, within that object, we're going to create a function. I'm going to call this, I guess, clock in. Actually, out too, because I'm going to use the same function for clocking in and clocking out. So I'm going to call it clock in out. So as of right now, we'll just think about this as just clock in. So I'm going to create that function again below this. And that's going to run when somebody clicks on that clock in button due to this event listener. Now, what do we want to happen when somebody clicks on that clock in button? We want to basically go grab the employee ID and verification code and submit it to our backend to basically compare if that matches the employee ID and verification code for that employee. And if it does, then we want to go in here and add a new line to our data worksheet. So all of that backend stuff we're going to do with a backend function. From the front end side, the only thing we need to worry about is just grabbing this information from this employee ID box and this verification code box. So we can do that by using these references. So this input right in here will have a reference to that input. So if we do dot value, that should get us what's the value inside of that box. And all of that will store in an object that we'll submit. Let's just call this payload. And inside of this payload, we're going to have employee ID. Let's just move these two separate lines. All of these can be on the same line, but this is probably a little cleaner. So comma, then we're going to do that second input value. So that's our verification code. And then finally, what type of action this is. So action in this case is going to be clock in. So that's the payload for this. Let's actually just comment this function end as well. and this one too. So now we basically have to send this information to the backend to basically run whatever we need to run. So we're going to do that by running google.script.run, followed by the function name from the backend that currently doesn't exist. So we'll just call that function clock in out. And to that function, we're going to just pass this payload from right here. I'm going to save this. Now we need to create this function in our server side to accept that payload and do something with it. So that we're going to do in this code.js side. So we're going to create that function. And that function is going to accept that payload over here. For now, I'm just going to leave that empty so we can test this before I actually add that. Let's just copy and paste that example for a payload. For now, over here. And the way this is going to look, when it's actually passed correctly, this is going to be one of those IDs. So, for example, that could be like this one. Let's actually use this one, 22222. And this will be 33333. And the action will be clock in. So when this is submitted to our server, we need to do a few checks. But for right now, I don't want to do any checks yet. I just want to grab this information and just put it in this data right in here as a new line. So just build the regular functionality of a regular Google form so far. So we need to basically add this timestamp, action, employee ID, and verification code in this particular order to this worksheet called data. And to do that, we're going to basically add a reference to our current spreadsheet. So we're going to take our spreadsheet app, get active spreadsheet. So in this spreadsheet, we want to store a reference to our worksheet called data. So we'll take that SS and get sheet by name. And the name is going to be data. So that refers to this name right in there. So now we should have access to this WS data. And to that, we can append a row. So basically add a new row. And I'm going to do a set of brackets like this. And this will be an array of those things. So the first thing is going to be the timestamp. So we can get that by simply just doing new date object in JavaScript, comma. Then the second thing is going to be the action. So that's going to be that payload.action. Then we have employee ID. And then finally, the last column here is verification code, V code from here. Now we want to run this to make sure that our function actually works and we also give all the permissions it needs to run. So I'm going to save this and run this function clock in out. So I'm going to change this to this particular function, run this function, give all the permissions it needs. And as you can see, it was executed, no errors. So if I go back and check this clock in and out, see we have this new line added with the current timestamp and date. So for now, I'm going to comment this and I'm going to add that payload here as a parameter to this function. Save this. So this way we should be able to now run this function from our HTML side from here. And this is that same function, clock in out, and we're passing that payload from here to that. So right now, if I go back to my form, refresh this, and we're going to add an ID. So now let's click clock in and see what happens, if anything. All right, let's go check our spreadsheet. Seems like we got our new line. So good. So our Function works, we're able to trigger it and enter the line. If I go back and change this information to, let's say, 8.9 and click clock in again, let's go back and check. See a new line added with this information. The thing we want to do probably after we clock in, we don't want to keep this employee ID and verification code here. We want to just clear that after this is done. To do that, I'm going to go back and add a success handler to this. And the idea of this is going to be if this clocking out function in our backend on our server side is successful, it's going to trigger this success handler. So now this is going to be our success handler over here. And after it's submitted, I want to basically just create a function in here to trigger once this is submitted. Let's actually do an arrow function here. It doesn't really matter. Both ways would work just fine. So what I'll do, I'll just grab those same two inputs and clear them. So I'll take this first input value and make it equal to blank. And then we'll take the second input value and make it equal to blank. So this should just help us to clear that form after the submission. So if I go back and reload this thing, if I click clock in, see after submitted, it will clear these boxes and we should have our line entered here. So all of that works just fine. So the next step I want to do, I want to make sure our clock out button also works. So right now clock out doesn't really do anything. So I want to make sure it works. And I want to be able to use the same function I just did, this, for both clock in and clock out. So to be able to do that, instead of hard coding this clock in here, I'm just going to pass an event to this function. And that event is going to pass because we're basically assigning this function, clock in out, over here, to the click event to this particular button, the clock in button. And that button will refer to whatever button we basically grabbed. So in this case, this one. So inside of that button, I did this data action attribute with this clock in as a reference. So I'm going to access that clock in from here, from this data action. And to do that, I'll go back to this and we'll have this E. And that E has this target attribute. So that would refer to the current element, that particular input element itself. And inside of that element, we'll have data set, which will refer to all those data attributes in that element. And we need the data attribute called action. So that action refers to, see this part, see data dash, whatever's after the dash action, that refers to that action part. So the data set is this, all this data dash attributes, and you could have multiples. Like for example, see here, there's data role and then data prepend. So this would be the data set, and dot role would refer to this, and dot prepend would refer to this. In our case, it's just one anyways, but we're going to do data action to get to this clock in value. So I'm going to go back. So that's that, etarget.dataset.action. So right now I'm going to just save this and make sure our clock in still works. So if this works properly, it should just automatically set this to clock in. So I'm going to refresh this, put something in here, and some verification code, hit clock in. Clears, let's go check. See, clock in. Maybe we should just do it the same way we did in our spreadsheet with uppercase, like this. And to do that, we just need to set the actual data attribute right in here to be not this one, but this one. to be clock in. See this one, this data action, and this one will set it to clock out. I assume I did it this way in the spreadsheet too. So at this point, all I have to do for my clock out to work is just go in here and add an event listener. So I'm just going to copy and paste this. And instead of assigning to the clock in button, I'm just going to assign it to the clock out button. And I'm going to add the same click event to this other button, but I'm going to trigger the same function. And what's going to happen, it's going to get the same target action value now from the clock out button, which says clock out. So now it should just work for both. So I should be able to now go refresh this. And I'm going to type something. And if I click clock in, we have our clock in, as you can see. And then if I go in here and do clock out, that should now be clock out. So all of that works just fine. I'm going to delete all of these. Now we have our clock in and clock out. It works depending on the button you click. At this point, we need to start doing some checks. So we don't want this to just automatically go in whatever employee ID and verification we enter. We want to cross-check, does that employee ID and verification code exist before we actually clock in and clock out? So that we're going to do on our server side right in here. And again, what I'm going to do for now, I'm just going to remove this payload from here and I'm going to uncomment this to build this backend functionality for that. So what we need to do, we need to first go to this employees worksheet and check, does the employee ID and verification code match to whatever submitted? So let's just store a reference to this employees worksheet. So we'll do that by doing another variable here. And we'll do the same get sheet by name, only this time the worksheet is called employees. So right here, let's go get the data from this employees spreadsheet. So we need the data that's in here pretty much. And I'm going to just need this much of this data. So I'm going to start from the second row, go until the last row, and grab the first two columns out of this. So we'll take this and get range. And we're going to start from the second row, first column. And the number of rows is going to depend on how many rows we already have. So if the last row is 6, then we need to get 5 items because the first one is going to be IDs and we're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, even though the last row is going to say 6. So what we're going to do here, we're going to take that worksheet, get last row in that, -1 for that headers. And we need to get this data for the first 2 columns. So 2. Get values to get all the data, and we'll store this in a variable. And I'm going to call this employee data. So that employee data at this point is going to refer to this data right here. And inside of this data, we need to check if we have an employee ID and verification code that match whatever employee ID and verification code we have from here. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to filter my data. And for each row in that data, I'm going to check if the row 0, which is the first column in that row, equals to employee ID, so payload.empid, which is this. And then at the same time, I want to make sure that the second column, which is the column of verification codes in that array, equals to payload.vcode, which is our verification code. So this is going to filter our table, and it's going to basically just leave the ones that match this employee ID and this verification code in that array. So we'll just say matching employee. Actually, I'll do employees. even though we should only have just one. There is going to be a little problem with this filtering. And the reason for that is because when we get these IDs and verification codes from the form, they're going to come back as a string like this. And when we check to our spreadsheet values right here, these are going to be numbers. And because of that, they're not going to match. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to add toString to the spreadsheet values to convert them to text. And then we'll do the check. So now we should have this matching employees array, which should basically return a single row of data if all this filtering goes well. If we get 0, that means there was no match. If we get more than 1, that means there's something fishy going on here. So the only time we're going to say that this was valid is when there's only a single match. So we'll just simply add an if statement. And we'll say if that matching employees.length is not equal to 1, then we know something is not right. So what we'll do, we'll throw an error. I'll also just add a return here, just in case. So essentially what I'm doing here, I'm checking if we have a single row matching from our employees table, then we know they have a valid employee ID and verification code. If not, then we're going to do this error and we're going to stop the execution of the rest of this code, just like that. So this should basically just stop us from adding a new record if we don't have a valid employee ID or verification code. So to test this, we're going to comment this, and we're going to pass the payload here as an argument. And then we'll go ahead and do the check to see what happens. So let's just do a test. So I'm going to go ahead and go under deploy, test deployments, and let's just open this link. This is our form. So let's try this. This is my data. Let's just try to enter some random employee ID and verification code and see if we get a new line. So I'll go in here and add some number and another number and click clock in. And hopefully nothing should happen. So as you can see, I get no new lines. Now, if I try a valid one, so let's try this. And click clock in again. See, that cleared this because that worked. If I go back, see, this is actually in here. So now let's try to clock out and enter a valid employee ID, but not a valid verification code. So I'm going to click clock out. Nothing is going on. Nothing is in here. If I go back and correct my verification code, click the same button again, we're good. So all of that is great. So we're able to actually check this and prevent this. Now it would be nice to have some sort of error message showing up in case there is an error instead of just doing nothing at all. So for that, what we'll do, we'll go back to our HTML. And basically, this is where our success is. Now, what's going to happen is that when you use this Google script run, in addition to this with success handler, we can also do this other callback, which is going to be when it fails. So instead of success, we're going to change this. And over here, it's going to be the function that's going to run when there is an error. And that error is going to be that throw error that I did. So in case that happens, this is what's going to get triggered. And we're going to do whatever we're going to do here, right in this brackets. And what I'll do, I'll just basically display the error message. So right in here. So what I'll do, actually, I'll just add a class here to hide this message by default. The none should do that from Metro UI. That's a class to hide this div. So what I'll do, I'll just add an error right here. That's my error message. And by default, it's going to be hidden. Now, what's going to happen, I want this to display this error message when there is a problem. So we can access that by accessing this. We already have a reference to that message element. So we'll just go to this section here, and we'll take that and to the class list of that element, actually from the class list, we're going to remove that class called the none. So what this is going to do, if I go back and enter, let's just refresh this, and enter some random ID and verification code. If I click clock in, see we get our error message. This error will stay here forever, as you can see. So what I'm going to do after we display this error, maybe in like 3 seconds or 2 seconds, we'll just hide the error message. And the way we're going to do that, after we do this to basically display the error message, we'll do set timeout. And in this, we're going to basically have a function that's going to run. And after that, we're going to have the time in milliseconds. So we'll do like in 3 seconds, 3000 milliseconds. So over here in this brackets is pretty much what's going to run. So what I want to do, I just want to basically have pretty much this line, only instead of remove, we'll add the class. So if I save this at this point and get back to my form, refresh this, type some number here or not a number, it doesn't matter, and click clock in. See, we got an error message. Now, in about 3 seconds, see that is gone. Good. It works and it's not submitting that to our spreadsheet. Now, the next thing I want to check, if somebody is clocked out, we don't want them to clock out again. Or if they're clocked in, we don't want them to clock in again. So what I need to do, I need to basically now take this table and filter this table to employee IDs that match the employee ID that was entered. And for example, if it was this 22222, it will filter this results to only the rows that have 22222 in them. So to do that, let's go back to our backend function after this if statement. So what we'll do, we'll go to that data, this WS data, and we need to do something very similar to this thing right here. Only we're going to get the data from here instead of getting it from here. So I'll go back in here, copy that line, paste it over here. And here, instead of getting from this employees worksheet, we'll get it from this WS data worksheet. We're going to start from the second row. We're going to start from, well, technically we don't really need this. So I guess let's start from column number 2. And then we're going to get it from this WS data worksheet from last row, again, -1. And we're going to do 2 columns to get this and this employee ID, these 2 columns. So that 2 is still valid right here. Now let's change this variable name. Well, actually, let's call it IDs data. So what I'll do in this, I'll again filter this similar to this one. And for each row, we're going to pass a callback. And in this array, and if you remember, I got the array starting from the second column like this. So inside of this, we need to check in the second column if employee ID is the correct ID. And the second column will be 0, 1 in that array. So that's going to be R1. We'll convert it to string again. And we're going to check if that equals to that employee ID that was passed to us. And this will return our new array with filtered data that will match that particular ID. Now, from this matching IDs, we need to make sure we get what's the action for the latest one. So out of the list we need to get the latest action in the list. And to do that, let's just create a constant here. We'll take that matching ID's data and we need to get inside of the last row of this data. So to do that, we'll take that array and get the length and do -1 because array counts starts from 0. So we need to offset that by 1 to get to the latest element. So that should get us to the latest one from our array. Now that will get us the whole row like this. Now from that row, we need to get this employee ID, which is the second item in the list. So that would be 0, 1. So I'm going to do another set of brackets and do 1 to get to the correct value. So this should give us our latest action, but this is only going to work in case that person already has something in this table. If this is the first time they're submitting something, they're not going to be in this table. So what I'll do, I'll check here and say if the length of that array that was returned equals to 0, meaning we got nothing, then what we're going to do, we're going to basically say the last one was clock out. Now, the reason I'm doing the clock out is because what I want to do, I want to make sure they clock in next. If they never had any record, then the next thing they have to do is clock in. And even if they had something in that particular table, if the last one is clock out, then they need to clock in. So basically that will equalize those two things. And at this point, that should give us what the latest action is. So what we're going to do at this point, we're going to add another if statement. And we want to check if the latest action equals to whatever they're trying to do now. So let's say right now, the action they're doing, they're trying to do clock out again, right? So that's going to be this payload.action. So basically, if they try to do the same thing as their latest action, so if the last time what they did was a clock out, we don't want the new one to be clock out. We know there's an error. And if they clocked in, we can't have them clock in again. So we'll just throw an error, pretty much exactly the same way, right in here, in case they try to do this. So another thing that's probably worth to check, in addition to this, is to make sure they didn't do any trickery to pass an action that's neither one of these things. So the only valid actions will be sign in and sign out. And we should probably check for that before we run any of this code going forward. So what I'll do, let's actually just copy this if statement and just put it right on top here before anything else happens. And what we'll do an array here of valid options, clock in, comma, clock out. And if that includes this bracket shouldn't be here. So we'll check if whatever's passed is in this array. And we'll do that by basically doing payload action. So we'll do payload.action. So if this payload action is not clock in or clock out, then we're going to consider that an error and stop the execution. So let's see if all of this works. So I'm going to save this, go back, reload this thing. Let's start by just entering some random ID and some random verification code. Click clock in, and that should give us an error, and that should also not go in our spreadsheet. Now let's try to clock out this person again with this employee ID and this verification code. So I'm going to go back here and do 22222, 33333, and click clock out. And as you can see, we got an error, and that shouldn't be added here to the spreadsheet. So we don't have a second clock out here. Now let's go back and take that same information and just click clock in. So apparently we got an error. That's not good. Let's go check what I did incorrectly. Clock in. Let's make sure the action is the same. Doesn't look like that's the problem. Let's go back to our code. So I'm going to have to console log some things here to see what happens. So let's just add a console log. And we'll just console log this latest action. And also we'll add another console log to log this matching IDs. Let's also add a console log to this. So let's check if it's actually passing this. So I'll save this, go back and reload the form, and do my 22222, hit clock in. We got an error. That wasn't done here. Let's go back to our code, and I'm going to go on the left under executions to take a look at this console logs. See, it says failed. Let's open that and see what happened. So it says it failed. It gives us that error, and it seems like it's happening on this line 13. Let's go back. And line 13 is, well, it's pretty much here. So it's not even getting to any of this stuff. It just fails in this check. I'm not seeing anything that's incorrect here. Let's also just console log the payload right in here. Save this, reload, and try this again. Let's go back and check our executions again and see what's going on. So see, action is clock in. It seems to be correct. Oh, of course. So I'm checking if this is in the list, and of course it's in the list. So we should check if it's not in the list, then throw an error. So this exclamation sign is missing here. So, well, a little bit of debugging, I guess, doesn't hurt. So we'll save this, go back and take a look at this again. Reload this thing. Again, 22222. And then I'm going to click clock in. So that went through. And as you can see, that's in. All right, that's good. So now let's go back and try to clock in again using the same data. Clock in. Now that's not good. That shouldn't have happened. So now we have to go check what else I got wrong. So our logs should help us. So let's take a look at our execution. The last one, initial check passed. So here is my problem. See, I did that log, which gives me the latest action. And instead of that being clock in or clock out, it was the ID. And that's because this should be the first column, so 0, not 1. So I'll save that, go back and reload this. Let's try this again. Let's just delete the last clock in out of here and try this one more time. So 22222. We'll get this right at some point. There it is, error. So we got an error. It didn't actually do that. Now let's go back and try to clock out. Now this now worked because it's a valid action. See, clocks out, no problem. If I go back and try to clock out again, it shouldn't work. Error, good. But I should be able to clock in. And I did. Good. So that works. The only thing I want to check is what happens if it's somebody who's not in this list. So let's just go to employees and add another employee here. I'll just give this person some ID and some sort of verification code. Okay, so that's that. So let's go and try to log in using this information. So we shouldn't be able to sign out, but we should be able to sign in. Let's just refresh this just in case. So I'm going to try to clock out. Error, that didn't work. Good. So now let's try to clock in. And that went through. And we got our data in. Very good. Seems to be working. The only thing left to do is probably just make this look a little nicer from the UI perspective. So I'll just add a little bit of container around this whole thing. So I'll go back to my form and right around this whole thing, we'll add a div with a class container. And we'll close this div after the whole thing is over. Basically, after this thing, all the way down here. And what this is going to do, it's just going to add some margins, paddings. See? So that's a little better. Let's add a little bit of line around this whole thing. So we should be able to do something like a panel. Let's try to find those. See this. So I'm going to put this inside of that container. And close that right above. Tab all of this in. Save. This should add a little bit of line around this. See, just like that. We should probably also make this a lot smaller. So what we'll do, we'll add a class to this panel, to this div. We'll call it like main box or something. And we'll style that main box right here below the style sheets. We'll do our styles. So I'll add a style container. And right in here, we'll do that class dot main box to refer to that class. And we'll just do a max width, something like 300 pixels. Semicolon to finish the line. Save this, go back and reload. See, that makes it a lot smaller. We probably want to center this in the middle of this whole thing. So we should be able to use flex boxes to do this, and they should have some flexbox classes for this. Let's search flex. See, there's this deflex. That's for the main container. So in our case, the main container is going to be this. So I'll add that to this. We also need to center the content inside of that container, which should be, see this right here, which is this flex justify center class. So I'm just going to copy that from here, go back and paste it here, save that. And at this point, if I reload this, that's centered. We probably need a little bit of padding or margin from the top to push this down. We'll just add a padding to the main container to the top. So here I'll just do PB padding bottom 3 as a size. We can do 4 for more, 2 for less, something like that. Well, that didn't seem to work very well. Oh, actually the padding top. We want to do the padding top of the main container. That creates a little bit of space. And I think they had some sort of title here for our panels. Let's go back to the panel. See this panel title. Apparently we just have to do this attribute. So I'll just copy that, go back to this panel. We'll add this attribute and change this title. So if I reload this, see we got the panel, we got all of this. The only thing probably left to do is to also style the actual error message. This. Let's add a class to the div. And I'm going to copy that and go back to the top and add some styles to this too. And we'll just add some background color. Background, let's spell that correctly. Let's do color white for the text. And maybe some paddings for the whole thing. Let's just see what this looks like. So I'm just going to save this, refresh, and just click clock in. See, we got the error message. We probably wanted that to be smaller and also to be pushed down a little bit. I don't know, about 7 pixels. Maybe add some rounding to this. And then also just push that down a little bit. So I'll just use bootstrap classes for this. Right in here, I'll do MT for margin top and do like 4 or something like that. So let's save that and reload. If I click clock in, we got our error message. I do clock out. We got our error message too. And if we do things correctly, apparently clock in I couldn't do. Do we already have that person? Yep, we already have that person clocked in. So I'm going to go ahead and clock out. Good. Works just fine. So that should do it.